It is a real pleasure to be here to share with you some of my thoughts about some aspects of globalization in the post-pandemic world. One of the things that's going to be happening is the pandemic is accelerating some of the tendencies, forces that were already in play. But as they've accelerated it, they have crystallized some of the challenges that the international community faces. What I want to do is to describe two contradictory forces at play. One set of forces are leading the world to move apart, deglobalization, as it were. And the other is bringing us more together. On the negative side, even before the pandemic, in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, there was, in a sense, a retreat from hyperglobalization. In the early years of this century, there was a belief that globalization was an inevitable force. It would go on and on. And particularly financial globalization resulted in large capital flows going from one country to another. Some of them, as we saw in 2008, were destabilizing. And the underregulation of America's financial markets led to a global financial crisis. In the years following that, foreign direct investment as a share of global GDP did not necessarily increase to all countries. We saw the ratio of trade to GDP, global GDP, going down. There are many reasons for these changes, including the nature of the structure of the production, moving from a manufacturing economy to a service sector economy. But the pandemic has accelerated these trends. What we've discovered, in a sense, is that we have constructed a global economy that was not resilient. The global supply chains were insufficiently diversified. We had built an economy, as it were, like a car without spare tires. All well and good as long as there's no problem, but when there is a problem, the system is not as resilient. In a sense, this lack of resilience echoes some of the problems that in the market economy that were exposed by the 2008 financial crisis. That crisis showed the market economy to be short-term. Its pursuit of short-run profits came at the expense of long-run stability. In this case, it was the excessive pursuit of short-term profits came at the expense of insufficient resilience. It seemed a good deal to save a little bit of a few pennies today, even if it meant we were going to be more dependent on others. The consequences have been very dramatic in the United States. Our market economy was unable to produce the masks, the ventilators, the protective gear that we needed, let alone the more complicated stuff like tests. And the consequence of that, of course, is that many more people have died than would necessarily have been the case. And this has contributed, although only one factor, to the devastation to the American economy. having learned these lessons, I think going forward in the post-pandemic world, we will want to create a more resilient economy. We will want to encourage more long-term thinking rather than just short-term thinking. There are many ideas that have been put forward of how to do that. For instance, giving more voice to long-term shareholders. What my colleague at Columbia, Patrick Bolton, has called loyalty shares. There are other things that this pandemic has exposed, deficiency in our overall social, economic, political system. One of the things I emphasized in my book, People, Power, and Profits, was that we had evolved into an unbalanced system in which there was insufficient attention paid to the role of government. 40 years of denigrating the role of government have resulted in a government that was ill-prepared to deal with a pandemic. The undermining of science that has been a hallmark of this administration in the United States has also had its toll. Every year there are proposals of reductions in science budgets of 30%, leaving us, of course, much less prepared to deal with an event, a pandemic, which requires science. Of course, the undermining of science has also meant that in the long run, economic growth will not have been as strong as it otherwise would be. If we ask the question, why is it that we are so much wealthier, our standard of living is so much higher than it was 200 and some years ago before the Industrial Revolution? It's been the advances of science and technology that have underlay all of this progress. And so it was, in a sense, irony that in the last 3 years, there's been this denigration of knowledge and the advances of science. So emerging from the pandemic, we will have to have a new social contract, which will be based on a better balance between the market, the government, civil society. Inevitably, when we have a crisis of these kinds, we turn to government. And we need a government based on science, truth, that can address the kind of challenges that the pandemic has presented. As we've discovered that we have been ill-prepared domestically to make the production of goods, as we've seen the difficulty of getting the resources, the goods that we need from abroad, it is natural that there is a tension, a walking away from the hyper-globalization that marked the world in the first years of this century. But at the same time, the pandemic, like climate change, has brought a realization that we live in a small planet together. We have to learn how to cooperate together. There is a need for cooperation, not just in areas of health, in the environment, in climate, but even on the economy. We are going to be inevitably highly interdependent. So as we face the pandemic and its economic consequences, we realize that we won't have the pandemic won't be really fully controlled unless it's controlled in every country. And there won't be a strong, robust global recovery unless there's a strong global recovery everywhere in the world. And so the reality is that we are going to have a high degree of cooperation. But while that is necessary, there is at the same time some very big tensions between various parts of the world, in particular, under Trump, between the United States and China. You know, at the end of the Cold War, there was a certain fantasy. Francis Fukuyama put forward the idea, the end of history. We were all going to converge to liberal democracies and free market economies. Well, 30 years later, it's clear that we're not quickly converging to this euphoria that was anticipated. It is very clear that China is not anytime soon going to move to become a liberal democracy. And in fact, if we look around the world, the number of people not living in liberal democracies has actually increased in a very disturbing way. But the fact that we share the single planet, the fact that because we share this single planet, we have to address common problems, means that we will have to learn how to cooperate, even with countries whose political systems we may disagree with. We will need to look at what the strengths of their systems are. We shouldn't be blind to their economic successes, but we shouldn't at the same time deny the differences and values that we may have. But fundamentally, we have to learn how to cooperate. I've heard a recent analogy saying, like, if you're in a lifeboat, you may be in a lifeboat with people you don't like at all, but you have to somehow row in a way that gets you to safe ground. And both with the pandemic and climate change, we all have to pull together to address these global problems that can only be solved globally. So the question is, how do we go about doing that? Well, I want to spend a few minutes both on the pandemic itself and the controlling the pandemic, and addressing some of the economic aftermath of the pandemic. In terms of the pandemic, one of the things that's absolutely essential is that the knowledge that is going to be core in fighting the pandemic is accessible and shared. You know, I have a lot of friends who are scientists who are engaging in active research and developing tests, vaccines, therapeutics. And they tell me, never has there been such cooperation. Individuals have put aside their concerns about publications or anything else in this rush to develop a good therapeutics, good vaccines to address the health aspects of the pandemic. It is absolutely essential that the knowledge that we develop to address the pandemic be shared everywhere. And that means, for instance, that all the patents be put into a patent pool, and that access to those be global. People have to pay royalties, of course, at reasonable rates. But this will make sure that the medicines are available at the lowest price possible. We use the force of competition to drive the price down. Unfortunately, in some quarters, there's a kind of vaccine nativism, vaccine protectionism, rather than saying it's important for the vaccine to be given first to those who are on the front line, for those who are healthcare providers, without whom we are all so much more vulnerable. There are a few who have taken the position the wealthiest should have first dibs. I think that should be unacceptable. You know, in the context of the flu vaccine, which every year we have new diseases, new variants of influenza, and so all the scientists have to get together every year to design a new vaccine. This kind of sharing has been institutionalized. Costa Rica has proposed a patent pool initiative, a sharing of intellectual property at the WHO, and that's received a lot of support. Unfortunately, some of our major drug companies have not participated. Some of the major countries have not been active participants. And this is an example of an area where there needs to be real cooperation going forward. In another arena, the economic aftermath, there is another area where the failure to do something early is now having consequences, and we are going to have to make up for lost time. That is the area of debt. Before the pandemic, many countries faced excessive debt. A variety of reasons. But the reality is that today, even countries that borrowed moderate amounts have seen their export earnings plummet, commodity prices fall, foreign investment move out of their country, financial flows going the wrong way, remittances going down, and they now face crises. In 2015, the UN General Assembly voted for a set of principles to guide debt restructuring. There is going to have to be debt restructuring. The only question facing the world today is whether it's going to be orderly or disorderly. And it would be much more humane, much more rational, much better for everybody if it were done in a orderly way. Unfortunately, even though those principles of orderly debt restructuring were supported overwhelmingly within the UN General Assembly, a few creditor countries, including the United States, refused to go along. They believed that power was more important than principles. Well, I think that if we don't have a principled guidance to restructuring, the economic future is going to be weak. And the antipathy to global financialism, to the global financial system, is going to be very great. So both support for our system and the short run strength of the global economy, both are at stake here. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing a glimmer of the way things might evolve. Argentina is one of the countries first to go into difficulties. The IMF has played a very constructive role. It has outlined the limits of sustainability, what the country can pay. You can't squeeze water out of a stone. And if you try, it will be you won't get anything. So the problem is that a few of the private creditors seemed to have no conscience and lack even a sense of rationality and reality. and they've been very slow to adjust to the pandemic realities. They have demanded, if all accounts that are in the media are correct, they have demanded amounts that are well beyond what the IMF says are sustainable. In the past, these demands for unsustainable debt restructurings have led to over and over again to economic disaster. Almost half of all debt restructurings have had to be restructured again within 5 years. So the point I want to make is that we are at a critical time where we need economic rationality combined with a certain humanity to devise a system of principled debt restructuring. And while we do that, the governments in the creditor countries have to put pressure on the financial sector, which they've rescued over and over again, to say, play your part in making sure that there is a strong global recovery. The rest of the world has gone on stay, but somehow the financial market keeps collecting interest as if nothing has happened, or if without at least a sufficient appreciation of what has happened. So let me conclude. I believe that we are in for a long and deep downturn. We should remember that the recovery from the Great Depression took 10 years. Started in 1929. It wasn't until World War II that we got out of it. The problem was there was not a comprehensive response and there was not a sustained response. Monetary policy is not going to get out of it, enable us to get out of this. We'll need a fiscal response. But given that the citizens of our countries are contributing so much to the recovery, they have the right to demand the nature of the recovery that they're financing. And so we have to have a vision of what kind of economy we want to emerge post-pandemic. It shouldn't be like the economy that we had before. We shouldn't go back to where we were. We need an economy based on greater equality, a greener economy, a more knowledge-based economy. We shouldn't let the large amount of debt scare us off from doing what needs to be done. And most importantly, for the purposes of my talk, we need to realize that this is a global problem that requires global cooperation, and we have to strengthen our global institutions in order to facilitate our being able to address this pandemic and the inevitable crises of one kind or another that we will be facing in coming years. Thank you very much for your time.